Hello, welcome to the Six Comms podcast. I'm here today with Nikki Smit. Hello, welcome, Nikki.
Hi, thank
How
you
are
so
you
much for
doing?
having me. I'm doing great. Happy to be
Good.
here.
Yeah. So this episode is called Creating Spaces for Everyone to Thrive, and it's part of the Conversations That Count series. And I just really want to emphasize this episode title, really. It's about everyone. It's about creating those inclusive spaces so everyone feels comfortable to communicate and to be able to voice their opinions and thoughts. And it's something I'm particularly passionate about because Six Comms is based around these 6 C's of effective communication. And the first C is around connection and also customization. So, customizing your message to enable everyone to take part in the conversation. And I know that you identify as neurodivergent and you work with the neurodivergent community. So I thought I'd just start in terms of our understanding around some of the terms that are used in this space. So let's first talk about neurodivergent. What does that mean?
So, I actually think a good place to start is to talk about neurodiversity first.
Okay. All
So,
right.
so if we think about neurodiversity, what that means is actually we are all neurodiverse. And so we all have different neurotypes and all of our brains are wired in different ways from each other. And so the world is neurodiverse. And so then when we talk about neurodivergent, what we're talking about there is people whose brains neurobiologically look different from what's typical brains. And so under that neurodivergent kind of identification, it's like an umbrella term for many different diagnoses. And so there's so many out there, but to name but a few: autism,
Mm.
dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD, OCD, even anxiety diagnoses form part of neurodivergence. And so that's really what I'm referring to when I say that I identify as neurodivergent and that I work within that space. And yeah, another kind of phrase that I think is really valuable and important to understand in the context, especially in the context of this podcast, is the neuro affirming movement or the neuroaffirming paradigm, which is the idea that I think previously we used to come at things like neurodivergence with a medical model. And so we would believe that these are things that we need to change or we need to fix, and you would pathologize neurodivergence. And so today we know that's not something that we need to fix or change. That's how we're wired and that's how we approach the world. And that actually it's a strength of ours. And so we want to come at neurodivergence with a strengths based approach. And of course, there are things that we might find more challenging or that are different about how we approach life, but those things can be accommodated and we can grow in that space. And there's so much value that we also bring to the world as neurodivergent people. And so I think one of the ways that I'm really trying to help people understand neurodivergence in a different way is that we used to think about neurodivergence as being on like a straight line. And you either have challenges that are this many challenges or you have this many challenges. And actually, neurodivergence is more like a circle, and we have different spokes on a wheel and we have different types of challenges. Some people might have more challenges, or they might need more support. That's the language that we're using more is where do you need support and how much support do you need? So I might need support in my communication, or I might need support with my sensory processing or with my executive functioning or things like that. So there's all these different areas that we might need support in. And that changes from context to context. and it changes with what else is happening in my day, and it's cumulative. And yeah, so that's a little bit of an idea of what I mean when I say neurodivergence.
Yeah, I love that. And thank you for correcting me as well, because I went straight in with the neurodivergent, but you're saying start with the neurodiversity and then talk about neurodivergent. And then you spoke around neuroaffirming. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's
I
great.
think
Because I'm going to be honest with listeners, I'm really like, how would I describe myself? I'm very curious about this space, but I am very much learning. And so I appreciate it. I mean, and I'm going to put it out there. If I say something that's not quite right, then I'm absolutely open for you to guide me with that and support me. Yeah.
And
Um,
I think we're all learning. Like I would say that I'm still learning, and I'd say that our kind of understanding and our knowledge is constantly shifting, and there's so much more research that needs to happen in this field. And so I think that attitude of curiosity is so valuable.
yeah. And I love the way you talk about the wheel. Like instead of a spectrum on a
Mhm.
line, it's a wheel and you have different spokes. And then you also talk about you might need a different wheel for a different context as well. So
Mhm.
there's really a lot of layers to this. What does neurodivergent mean to you on a personal level?
Yeah, so I'm happy to share about that. So for myself, I was a neurodivergent child and I grew into a neurodivergent adult, and that's how it works. And when I was a kid, we didn't know much about neurodivergence, and I don't even think that kind of label would have been really freely used at that time. And so I was a kid that was very vibrant and very spirited and always on the go and on the move, always spinning around upside down, loved to dance, very creative, academically quite strong as well, but inconsistent. So sometimes performed very highly and sometimes not so much in the academic setting. And I had wonderful parents who provided, even without having this like knowledge. And today they'll say, we wish we'd known these things about you then and we would have done things a little bit differently. But I really have the view that they did a lot of awesome things to support me and they accommodated my needs in many ways. So some of the examples are like, I think my dad would do a lot of writing with me. And so he would be like a conversation partner who would like brainstorm ideas with me because all the ideas were here. I sometimes just had difficulty getting them out, and he would help me get started. Or sometimes he would be my scribe for me, and I would be like upside down on the sofa or running around the room, shouting out my ideas, and he would help me structure them. And I think my mom was really amazing at helping with some of my executive functioning things, and she would help me manage and understand time better and put in accommodations around that. Another part of my neurotype is something called selective or situational mutism, this is actually the first time I'm talking about this publicly at the time of recording this podcast. So what that is about. So when we look at neurodivergence, like I said, it's like a wheel and there's different parts of things that might be challenging for you. And one of the things we mentioned was communication. And so for some people, we all have different communication styles, right? And I think some of the things that come up for neurodivergent people, just to mention but a few, some of us are more direct in our communication. Some of us, eye contact doesn't look how it looks for a neurodivergent person. For some of us, we like to share a lot of information about a specific topic. Sometimes we call that info dumping. Some of us jump around topics a lot. Some of us need more explicit communication rather than hidden meanings or things like that. So that's one piece of communication. But the other piece is that some people use what I like to call like mouth words or spoken communication in a different way. And some people don't use spoken communication at all. And some of us lose access to our spoken communication at times. And so that's what the situational or selective mutism piece refers to. And so for me as a child, the way that it came up was there were moments where I wouldn't have access to spoken language. And it didn't mean that I was nonverbal, and it didn't mean that I wasn't communicating, because there's so many ways that we communicate with each other. But I wasn't using spoken language. And that was very confusing for people, because there were other times where I was this like spirited, loud child. And what was really confusing for my parents was put me on a stage and I would be like taking over, which is very confusing, right? Like it doesn't really make sense. And so even today, that's still kind of part of my profile, and it depends on the context and the time and what else has happened. And I'm sure people listening to this today will be like, that sounds really weird. She's talking to us right now. And that's totally part of it. And I think another part of my neurodivergence is that I'm high masking. And so what masking means is when you, sometimes it's called camouflaging as well. And so what that means is that at times people might hide or suppress some of their ways of being to fit into society. And so it's something that we might sometimes choose to do, or we have to do for safety reasons.
Mm.
But really what we want to do is we want to create spaces where people feel safe to be their authentic selves. And masking is an interesting one, because even though we might still sometimes choose to do it to connect with people or for safety, as I mentioned, there are risks. There's big mental health risks for masking. And so, yeah, I think that when you think of that neurodivergence being on a straight line, you might think, oh, someone's like really we used to refer to as high functioning. They can do all these things, or oh, they're just a little bit neurodivergent is something that I've also heard before. And that like doesn't really exist. What might be happening is that person's high masking, or they have less support needs in the areas that you're seeing them in. And so, yeah, what does neurodivergence mean to me? I mean, I think I see it as a springboard. For me, I've created with a lot of wonderful support in my life and a lot of like self reflection and self understanding. I've created a lifestyle that suits my neurotype. And I'm very lucky to have built a career where I can follow my curiosity around these things, and where I like have the privilege to support other neurodivergent people or the loved ones of neurodivergent people, or the communities or the workspaces of neurodivergent people, to build more inclusive spaces. So yeah, I love the creativity that comes with it. I feel like that's like one of my strengths. And the more I kind of embrace it and live authentically, the more I can be creative and make a difference.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Well, thank you for sharing that, and thank you for doing that the first time on this podcast. I feel actually really humbled by that and very grateful. So thank you for sharing that.
Well, thank you for creating a safe space for that.
There was lots of language in there that is new, and I think people, as we said at the beginning, are still learning. We're still open and curious about it, and it's great that you've helped me, because when we first met, I was like, oh my goodness, like what's masking? Oh my goodness, she's saying about selective mutism. I was like, that was the first time I'd heard that phrase. And yeah, I'm really curious about it. Like, it's fascinating to me. I
Mm.
like that whole idea of like what you were saying about losing the access to spoken language. I mean, that's
Mm.
huge. And I'm just
Yeah.
thinking about people like yourself who are very much busy, got full lives, that are running businesses, or they're in organizations with very busy professional lives, going to meetings, and then having this in the background that's like this could
Mm.
happen, that you could lose access to spoken language. And the fact that people are going around, as you say, maybe highly masking, or the other term, I'm testing myself here as well, I'm writing a lot of notes. Camouflaging, you said, is the other
Mm.
term that's
Yeah.
used. And when you said about that mental health risk, because if you're doing that all the time, every day, then accumulatively, I can really feel that would be sucking and draining your energy.
Mm,
Would that be right in
absolutely.
saying that?
Absolutely. I think actually what would be quite helpful as well to understand in the context of all of this. So as a therapist, I work a lot around nervous system regulation. And if you'll allow me to speak a little bit of science for a couple of minutes, because I think it's really helpful, is understanding that a lot of this is around dysregulation. And so, what is regulation, dysregulation?
Mm.
Really, at the foundation, first of all, it's our levels of arousal, but it's also about how do we respond to the environment and the environmental needs and the environmental demands? And so, if you think about that, one of the phrases that gets used a lot is that's our window of tolerance. So, that is our space where we can adapt to the environment and the environmental needs. And so, another way of thinking of that is having like a cup of things that might dysregulate us throughout the day. And some people have a smaller cup and some people have a bigger cup. And when things spill outside of that cup or outside of that window of tolerance, that's when we become dysregulated. And dysregulated can look different, right? So sometimes we think of dysregulation as like anger outburst or as someone having like a meltdown. But really, dysregulation can look very different. It might be some people get really silly when they're dysregulated. They laugh a lot or they get giggly, and some people shut down, right? So, and that's where you start to think of this like fight or flight response. So that's where you're activated, or a freeze response, which is where you're in shutdown. And so if you think of something like selective mutism, I like to think of it as a freeze response because you're in shutdown. And so I think this is really valuable in the context of what you just mentioned, where people are going into meetings and they're interacting with each other and starting to understand that people might be, if we think of it all as dysregulation, that's helpful. And so if you think about when information comes into your brain, it first goes into kind of like the what I call the downstairs part of your brain. And that's where it decides if something is safe or not safe. Because at the end of the day, I hate to break it to you guys, but your brain's job is survival. It's not happiness, not joy, it's survival. And so that's the first thing it's going to decide, is the safety or is it a threat? And so, and then we move into other parts of the brain. And for like, just to keep things at a easy to understand level, the upstairs part of your brain is where you have language, where you have curiosity, where you have logical thinking. And so that's in the upstairs part of your brain. So if your brain is perceiving something as threatening, you're not accessing those centers really. So when we're trying to have meaningful conversations with people at work, and if you are in your downstairs brain, we're not we're not really, that's really tough. So I think like starting to think about that and how can we first of all like identify when someone is in that space or they're
Mm.
not feeling very safe or they're dysregulated or I'm dysregulated. And then can we have that conversation at a different time? Or what can I do to ground myself in that moment and have a meaningful conversation? And this is, of course, important for neurodivergent people, but for everyone, really.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I mean, yeah, going back to the theme of this episode, it's creating those spaces for everyone to thrive. And
Yeah.
what you're mentioning there, like this idea of the downstairs brain and the upstairs brain. I mean, I just wrote down like a phrase. I'm in my downstairs brain. Could we go around
Yeah.
like saying that, like declaring that I'm in my downstairs
Yes.
brain? So I'm not going to be open. I'm not going to be curious. I'm not going to have a
Yes.
meaningful conversation right now. And being
I
aware of
say
it.
that.
Do you
Yes,
say that?
I say
Yeah.
that to my partner. Yeah, we have that. So, and I think it's so valuable. It's such a valuable, and what it takes the kind of stress and pressure out of the situation a little bit.
Mm.
And it puts the onus on everyone in the conversation. And I think one other kind of concept that's helpful and I think linked to this a little bit is there's this thing called the double empathy problem, which is double empathy problem. Yeah. And we can put a link to some of this information in your notes,
Yeah.
but this is a study that was done, and I'm not going to remember the authors' names because that's not one of my strengths. But they did the study where they took autistic individuals and a group of neurotypical individuals, and they looked at the communication between the group of neurotypicals and the group of autistic individuals, and there was a breakdown in
Mm.
communication. They didn't understand each other. It was hard to take each other's perspectives. Then they did between neurotypicals, and there wasn't a breakdown. And then they did between autistics, and there also wasn't a breakdown. And so what it shows is that because if you work in this neurodivergent space, there's a lot of like, oh, it's hard to take perspective for neurodivergent people. And that's not entirely true. And what we see is the focus needs to also be on both sides, right?
Mm.
So, and I think I like the idea of thinking if you've moved through space where things have been relatively easy for you and you haven't had to put a lot of thought into that, perhaps the onus is on you to get a little bit uncomfortable and to start taking people's perspectives. So, yeah, I think
Mm.
that's a really valuable thought as well.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and that really like speaks to another C that I campaign for, which is compassion. Yeah, just really being compassionate of everyone's needs and
Yeah.
styles and way they approach things because
Absolutely.
everybody's
And I
different.
think 100%. And I think having that context gives compassion, right?
Yeah,
Like it leads to compassion.
yeah. I mean, just speaking to you the few times that we have, I mean, it was just once before
Mm.
this, and now I can already feel a greater understanding or appreciation that I didn't have before because I wasn't familiar with these
Yeah.
terms. So just keep having these conversations, and for you to be courageous enough to be open and
Mhm.
bring this knowledge to me, then I can increase my compassion because then I feel like I better understand these
Yeah.
terms.
Amazing.
And just coming back to the language in this space, because I think it's really important when we're trying to create those more inclusive spaces. So, say we are in organizations, we're having those meetings, what language particularly should we be mindful of?
I think in terms of language, there's a few ways to think about it. I think there's certainly more inclusive language that we're using in terms of, and one of them is thinking about that thing that we talked about, neurodivergence not being on a straight line. So
Mm.
talking about people being high functioning is not really language that we're using anymore. We're rather describing people's support needs. And yeah, I think there's a lot of kind of language shifts in the neuro affirming movement. So things like a lot of autistic people prefer to use language saying that they are autistic. So I'm allistic, so I'm non-autistic. So I'm not speaking from my own personal experience. I'm
Mm.
speaking from the knowledge I've gained from the community. And yeah, so previously we might have used language where we'd say the person first language. So we'd say a person with autism,
Okay.
and what the community is feeling that separates them from their autistic identity, and that actually that's a part of who they are. And so like you wouldn't say if you're a woman, I'm a woman with femaleness, or I'm a person with femaleness. You would say I'm a female. So people feel differently about this, and I think the key with all of this stuff is to ask. And
Mm.
the key is to be open and to ask people what language do they prefer. I think in terms of other things, and maybe this is not what you're asking, so please feel free to dive in and redirect me. But I think other things to think about is things like people's sensory needs
Mm.
and their sensory preferences. And the truth is, we all have sensory preferences. So we all use sensory things to regulate ourselves. and you might not even notice it. You chew on your pen, or you flick your pen, or you shake your leg in a meeting, and you're using that to regulate yourself, whether you're consciously aware of it or not. And this is probably a whole nother podcast for another time, but there are actually 8 sensory systems. So there's not the 5 that we learned about at school. There's 3 more, and those ones are internal to you. So it's your awareness of where you are in space. It's your awareness of movement. It's your awareness of your internal sensations and knowing how regulated you are. How are you feeling? What does a feeling feel like? So it's quite complex, but I think as kind of employers and employees, if we can understand that people have sensory preferences, and those at a very basic level might look that some people need more sensory input. So they might, for example, need to move. So right now we've been talking, I'm on a chair that can move. I'm holding a fidget that I can squeeze, which is giving me movement. I've got a little thing that my feet are bouncing on. So I need that extra input to stay focused, right? But I'm also have sensory sensitivity. So in certain contexts, loud noises are dysregulating for me, for example, or some people might be sensitive to certain textures or certain lighting. And I think as organizations, if you can become more aware of things like that's not language, but it is language as well, because can we talk about what preferences people need? And if you're sitting in a space and you are going to put your headphones on because you need to get on with some work, you're not being rude to people. You're just meeting your system's needs so that you can get done what you need to do, for example. Or can we explore as a community in our office what kind of lighting would be better for people? Can we consult with an expert that knows about that stuff so that we can create spaces that are more inclusive?
Yeah. Gosh, I resonate so much with all that you said. And I did notice you holding that, what do you call it? A fidget.
A fidget, I
A
guess. Yeah.
fidget. Yeah. I did notice and I was curious about it. I was going to ask you, but you answered me before I got a chance to ask you. But the light thing really resonated for me because I've always been really sensitive to light. And a lot of office buildings and supermarkets, especially, have that strip lighting and it makes me feel quite
Horrible.
nauseous. So,
Nauseous, right?
yeah, nauseous. And as I'm a learning facilitator, I'm using indoor spaces, but I've also tried to experiment with outdoor spaces.
Yeah.
And I'm very aware. The other day, I went and facilitated a workshop inside, and I really felt confined in the room because the table was a bit big for the space. And so I
Wow.
felt a bit claustrophobic. And I said this to the co-facilitator and I said, I think I've spoilt myself because I really like the outdoor space. And every time I come inside now, I feel really confined and limited.
Yeah.
So yeah, that really resonated with me, what you said
Yeah.
about the space and the lighting. And I'm fascinated by the fact that there's 8 sensory preferences. As you said, that is another episode. I might invite you on again actually
Yeah.
to
Oh, I'd love
explore
it.
some
I
of
love
that.
talking about this stuff.
Wow. Okay. So getting back to the question, I'm just so overwhelmed actually with like the knowledge I'm receiving from you. It's incredible. So okay, let's get back to the question. If you know a colleague or team member is identifying as neurodivergent and they've been quite open about that,
Mm,
what should you be mindful of? And maybe what are the questions that you could be asking to better support that colleague?
I love this question. So I think first of all, like having a attitude of curiosity is setting your intention in that way is just so beautiful, because this is how we're going to change the world. This is how we're going to create more inclusion where we go. So I think having open conversations about how people operate best, and what what can I do to better support you? And sometimes that's too open-ended, and sometimes that's like kind of an overwhelming question. And I think that the intention is there, and if you it's through relationship that we can build the safety for someone to feel like they can be open about those things. I think what's really amazing is if employers can start to build a culture where we are open to that and where you have neurodivergent people coming into your company to share about this stuff. And first of all, from their personal experience, because we as neurodivergent people are the true experts in this. And then from a scientific perspective to understand all these things, where the two meet is really interesting. But I think to start building conversations where people can share what support needs are helpful for them, which ways, and I think like if you're, say, working alongside someone, asking them, how do you communicate best? What is most helpful? Do you want more direct conversation? Is it helpful for you if I'm more specific in my language? Or what sensory needs do you have? How do you do in a space like this? What can we do to support you? I think not everyone's going to feel super comfortable to be as open about that stuff, but I think if our intent is to create spaces where it's safe to share that stuff, because the truth is we all have different needs. And I think asking those questions and starting the conversation is really awesome. Does
Yeah.
that sort of answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. And I think those questions are really important. So I'm just going to repeat them back if you don't mind and just
Sure.
let me know if I've got them right. So I think this is a great question that you can ask absolutely everyone should be asked. How do you communicate best? Because how often
Mm.
do we actually have that open conversation to say, okay, what channel do you prefer? I mean, as simple as,
Yeah.
are you better on a WhatsApp? Or do you like me to pick up the phone and talk to you? Or you prefer a video
100%.
call? I mean, there are so many channels now that I really don't think we're taking the time to check in, like you say, and ask the
Mm,
question. I like the way you phrase, is it helpful for you? And then you fill in
mm,
that blank. So, what is helpful
mm.
for you? How can I better support
Yeah,
you? And then that question of what sensory needs do you have, and talking about spaces and how can we improve the space so that you feel more comfortable? I think that's a really great
yeah,
question as well.
yeah.
So, if you are struggling at work, if you're listening at the moment and you're struggling at work, are there like three tools or techniques that you would recommend that we all have in our toolbox that's going to better support
Mm.
us?
Okay. So I have a few thoughts. I'll try and be concise into three. I'll try and choose my top three. So I think my first thing that I really want to advocate for is that people start learning from the neurodivergent community. So, what I mean by that is if you have the resources, reach out to neurodivergent advocates or therapists or coaches to come and speak to your community or have a consultation with people like us. Start reading books by neurodivergent people, follow us on Instagram, listen to our podcasts so that you are learning from true experts. I think that there's so much valuable information out there now, and people are starting to feel empowered to share their stories. And I think that's a really wonderful way to learn. So that would be my first one. I think the second one is to, as much as you can, start using a nervous system lens to think about these interactions that you're having with people. And there's a few things from that perspective that you can do that I think are valuable. Because if you're thinking about that nervous system lens, so is someone in their upstairs brain or their downstairs brain, are they regulated? You're going to start looking for people's signs of dysregulation or noticing your own signs of dysregulation in your body. What does that feel like for you? What does that look like? And then you can make adaptations based on that for yourself. I think noticing when you're getting dysregulated and being able to put in supports, because remember, dysregulation is cumulative. So if we aren't putting in supports for ourselves or we aren't finding ways to regulate ourselves throughout the day, it's just going to build. And that's when we then have the explosions. So some things that you can try, there's lots of things. There's lots of sensory strategies. Some people like movement, people like chewing on something or things like that, or just breath. like breath alone is such a regulating thing. So one of like a tip that I can give you today that if you just try it now, you'll feel different is simply extending your exhalations. So taking a breath in and then doing a longer exhalation. And the nervous system just relaxes and releases when you do that. And that's something that I think you can do that while you're in conversation with someone, right? So I think that's my second one. And then just starting to be a little bit brave and starting to have conversations with people. I think as a neurodivergent person and advocate, I'm still so surprised when people ask me to share my story or ask me what my preferences are because it still feels so unusual. And I just think if we can shift that, if you can start being more open about these conversations, what it does is it takes the stigma out of it.
Mm.
And that's what we really need. So yeah, I think those would be my three.
Excellent. So we've got the first one, learning from the neurodivergent community, listen to the podcasts, read books, talk to the experts because they're the experts. The second one is using the nervous system as a lens. So thinking about how you become dysregulated and what you can do
Mhm.
to counteract that. Because this phrase you've mentioned quite a lot, dysregulation is a cumulative. So,
Yes.
don't wait. It's like a day to day
Yeah.
thing.
Be
Um,
proactive, I
yeah.
normally say. Yeah.
And the third one, be brave. Have those conversations, approach someone from the neurodivergent community and ask those questions and see what you get back. I mean, I'm certainly so grateful to have approached you and yeah, and asked those questions because it's just fascinating, this topic, and we could speak for a lot more. But we've come to the very last question that I ask all my guests, which is around those 6 C's that I mentioned,
Mm.
the 6 C's of effective communication. So they are connection, curiosity, compassion, clarity, customization, and consistency. We've mentioned a few in there, but I'm
Yeah.
going to be a bit tough on you, and I'm going to ask you to just choose one
Oh
that
my
resonates
goodness.
most with you in terms of this topic. What do you think?
I think I have to go with connection because I think it summarizes everything. And I think it's from where everything starts. And I don't think you can fully separate curiosity and connection from each other because it's hard to separate any of these. It's a very tough question.
I know.
But I really believe that through connection, you are being curious about someone and you're showing that intent of wanting to meet someone where they are and wanting to put yourself in their shoes and wanting to take their perspective. And it's through relationship that people feel safe to be authentic and to change and evolve as people. So, yeah, that would be my answer.
Yeah. So connection. But yeah, I agree with you. Curiosity is connection's best friend. That's what I say.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I love
It's been such a pleasure, Nikki. Thank you so much for being so open and sharing of your personal story and your work. Yeah, I'm really blown away by how open you've been. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for doing this work and for creating a space where I felt safe to.